There was no announcement, no introduction, no warning of any kind. The room was alive with the easy noise of old friends, glasses, laughter, the hum of people who had known each other for decades. An October evening in a private London home. Champagne, firelight, the kind of gathering where nothing unexpected was ever supposed to happen. And then George Harrison sat down at the piano. Nobody noticed at first. He moved quietly, the way he always did, without needing the room's attention. He settled onto the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The melody was slow and unfamiliar, something deeply private, as if the man hadn't quite decided to let anyone hear it. But they heard it. One by one, conversations stopped. A woman near the fireplace went silent mid-sentence. A man lowered his glass and forgot it was in his hand. The laughter fell away. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It pulled back gradually, like a tide, until there was nothing left but the piano. And then Paul McCartney heard it. He was standing across the room when the chord reached him. He didn't gasp. He didn't turn dramatically. He simply went still. His hand rose slowly and pressed flat against his chest. Whatever had been on his face a moment before, the ease, the warmth, the confidence of the most famous musician alive, was gone. In its place was something raw and exposed that no one in that room had ever seen before. To understand what that song did to Paul McCartney, you first have to understand what Paul McCartney once did to that song. If this story is already pulling you in, hit subscribe. These are the moments history always leaves out. Nobody dared ask it out loud. Why this song? Why tonight? And why, after 30 years of silence, had George Harrison finally decided to play it? To understand what happened in that London room in October 1999, you have to go back 30 years. Back to a cold January morning in 1969, when a 25-year-old man walked into Abbey Road Studios, carrying a song he had spent 2 years building, note by note, word by word, in the quiet hours that John and Paul never seemed to need. His name was George Harrison, and in the greatest band on earth, he was the one the room never quite turned toward. It was not cruelty. It was not conspiracy. It was something more difficult than either of those things. It was simply the natural gravity of two suns so bright that everything else in the solar system learned to orbit quietly and not ask for too much light. John Lennon and Paul McCartney had been writing together since they were teenagers in Liverpool. Their partnership was instinctive, almost biological. They shared a creative language so fluent that when George arrived at a session with something he had spent weeks crafting, it sometimes took less than 4 minutes for the conversation to move on without him. By January 1969, George had written some of the most emotionally sophisticated music of his life, songs that reached inward in ways the Beatles had never publicly attempted. He wasn't trying to compete. He was simply trying to be heard. That morning, he sat down at the piano outside Abbey Road's main room and began to play something new, a song called All Things Must Pass. He played it slowly, explaining the chord movements, describing what the lyric was reaching for. The room listened, partially. John was distracted, his attention drifting toward the far wall. Paul nodded at intervals in the way a man nods when he is already thinking about something else. Within minutes, someone suggested moving on to a different arrangement. The session shifted. The song was set aside with the soft finality of something that was never meant to come back. George did not argue. He never argued. He gathered his papers, put on his coat, and walked out through the Abbey Road car park alone. He sat in his car for a long time without starting the engine. The January air pressed against the windows. Inside the studio, the others had already moved on. He drove home in silence that evening. And somewhere between Abbey Road and his front door, George Harrison made a decision that would last 3 decades. He would never play that version of that song for anyone again. What none of them knew was what that silence would cost. For 30 years, George Harrison kept that promise to himself. The song was released on his 1970s solo album, triple record, celebrated worldwide, Frank Sinatra calling something the greatest love song of the century. But the private piano version, the raw version, the one he had played that January morning while the room looked away, was never touched again. George filed it somewhere deep and quiet inside himself, the way a man files away the things that hurt too cleanly to revisit. The years that followed gave him other rooms to fill. A solo career that outlasted every prediction. A garden at Friar Park in Oxfordshire that he tended with the same patience he had once given to music. A spiritual life, meditative and private, that required far less from the world than the world had always required from him. He had found his own kind of peace, the peace of a man who had learned to need less. But in 1997, something arrived that George Harrison could not tend his way out of. The diagnosis was throat cancer. He told almost no one. He handled it the way he handled everything, from the inside, without drama, without asking the world to stop and notice. He underwent treatment. He continued working on new material. He walked his garden in the mornings and said very little about what the doctors were telling him in private. To the people around him, he appeared calm. Those who knew him best understood that his calm had never been the absence of feeling. It was the presence of something deeper, something he had been building quietly since the Beatles fell apart in 1970. But illness does something to the architecture of a man's interior life. It removes certain walls. It makes the things a person has been carrying feel heavier than they did before, not because they have grown, but because time has suddenly become something with visible edges. George began moving differently through his days, slower, more deliberate. Friends noticed that he had started returning to old recordings, not to revise them, but simply to listen, as if he was taking inventory of something he hadn't fully examined in years. And somewhere in that inventory, there was a London dinner party in October 1999, a private gathering of old friends. Paul McCartney would be there. George accepted the invitation without explanation. He mentioned it to almost no one. But in the weeks before that evening, a close friend later recalled that George had said something quietly, almost to himself, in the middle of an ordinary conversation. "There are things I should have played for people a long time ago," he said. His friend didn't ask what he meant, and George didn't offer anything further. He simply went back to what he had been doing and waited for October to arrive. If this story is reaching something in you, subscribe and stay with us. The moment you came here for is almost here. But what nobody at that party could have known was this. George Harrison did not walk through that door in October 1999 as a guest. He walked through it carrying 30 years of silence, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to put it down. The party had been going for 2 hours when it happened. 24 people, a fireplace burning low on the far wall. The kind of room that collected warmth easily. Old photographs, good wine, the particular comfort of people who had survived the same decades together and didn't need to explain themselves. George had moved through the early part of the evening quietly, the way he always moved through rooms, present without demanding presence, listening more than he spoke, standing near the window for a while before drifting toward the edges of other conversations without ever quite entering them. People who noticed him that evening said he seemed lighter than usual, not distracted, not withdrawn, simply settled, as if something inside him had already been decided. Paul McCartney arrived 40 minutes into the evening. The room adjusted itself around him the way rooms always did, subtly, instinctively, the way a space reorganizes itself around a gravitational center, without anyone acknowledging it out loud. He and George found each other early. The embrace was brief and genuine. They spoke for several minutes near the drinks table, nothing significant, nothing that anyone standing nearby could later reconstruct with certainty. Two old men, old history, old warmth underneath the old weight of everything that had never quite been resolved between them. Then Paul moved deeper into the room, and George moved toward the piano. It was a black grand piano positioned at the far end of the room, the kind of instrument that exists in certain London homes, not to be played, but to be present. George sat down on the bench without drawing attention to himself. He adjusted his position once. He looked at the keys for a moment, just a moment, the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a very long time. Then he placed his hands down and began to play. The first bars were quiet, almost inaudible beneath the surface noise of the room. A melody that belonged to no recognizable geography, not rock, not pop, not anything the guests could immediately place. Something older than category, something that seemed to be arriving from a place that had no name. The first person to stop talking was a woman standing near the fireplace. She went silent mid-sentence and turned her head slowly toward the piano without quite understanding why. Then a man nearby lowered his glass. Then a couple near the door stopped moving entirely. It happened without coordination, without signal. The room simply began to listen, the way people listen when something real is occurring, and the body understands it before the mind does. Within 90 seconds, the room was completely silent, and then Paul McCartney heard the chord change. He was standing with his back partially turned, midway through a conversation, when it reached him. A specific harmonic movement, 4 notes descending in a sequence that existed nowhere else in the world, except inside a song he had heard exactly once, on a cold January morning in 1969, when a 25-year-old man had played it quietly in a studio, while the room failed to listen. His body registered it before his memory did. He stopped speaking. He turned slowly, and then his hand rose, without intention, without theater, and pressed flat against his chest. His face did not collapse. It did something more devastating than that. It opened. Every layer of composure, of confidence, of 50 years of being Paul McCartney, it fell away in a matter of seconds. What remained underneath was something nobody in that room had a name for. Grief, maybe. Recognition. The particular expression of a man who has just understood something about himself that he cannot immediately speak. George played it all the way through. Every movement, every unresolved ache buried inside the chord progression. His eyes were closed. His shoulders were slightly forward. He was not performing. He was not making a statement. He was simply, finally, finishing something he had started 30 years ago in a cold studio while no one was paying attention. When the last note faded, his hands rested on the keys. The room held its breath for 3 full seconds. Then Paul McCartney walked across the room toward the piano. Paul McCartney crossed that room the way a man walks when he is no longer thinking about how he looks doing it. He moved past the fireplace, past the small clusters of guests who parted without being asked, past the drinks table and the low amber light, all of it dissolving around him as if the room had narrowed itself to a single point. The piano bench, the man sitting on it. George Harrison had not yet lifted his hands from the keys when Paul reached him. He simply stood there for a moment, looking down at his oldest friend. This man he had known since they were teenagers, standing on a Liverpool street corner with cheap guitars and enormous, uncontainable ambition. And something crossed his face that the people nearest to him would spend years trying to find the right word for. He placed his hand on George's shoulder. Nobody else in that room heard what Paul said. The guests nearest to the piano later described leaning slightly forward without realizing it, as if their bodies understood that something important was being exchanged and wanted proximity to it, even without access. What they saw was this. Paul bent toward George, spoke quietly, and George received the words with his eyes steady and his jaw loose. Not surprised, not relieved, something more complicated and more complete than either of those things. George gave a single slow nod, and then, for the first time that entire evening, he smiled. Not the polite practice smile of a man moving through a social occasion. Something real. Something that belonged to the part of him that existed before the fame, before the fracture, before 30 years of carrying a song that nobody in the most important room of his life had thought was worth finishing. The applause, when it finally came, was unlike any applause in that room's history. It was quiet, the kind that feels almost too private to make, as if the people offering it understood they had witnessed something that was never intended for an audience. A music industry veteran who had attended that gathering, a man with 4 decades of concerts and award ceremonies behind him, said afterward that he had never heard a room respond to music the way that room responded that night. Not in any arena, not at any ceremony, not once in 40 years. The evening continued, but it had permanently changed its shape. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter, more careful. The way conversations go after something true has moved through a room and rearranged everything it touched. George remained at the piano for a while, speaking with guests who drifted toward him in ones and twos. He did not explain the song. He did not offer context or history. He answered questions about other things and let what had just happened exist without annotation. Paul stayed close to the piano for a long time, and when the evening finally ended, as the coats were being gathered near the front door, Paul caught George's arm in the entrance hall. They stood together in the quiet space between the party and the night outside. Paul said something. George nodded once more, and when they shook hands before stepping out into the cold London air, it was not the handshake of 2 men saying goodbye. It was the handshake of 2 men who had finally said something else entirely. If this story is moving you the way we think it is, subscribe and share it, because some moments deserve to be heard by more than 24 people. George Harrison was diagnosed with a brain tumor 4 months after that evening. He would never perform publicly again. And in the long, difficult year that followed, Paul McCartney said very little about that October night in public, until one private conversation finally surfaced, years later, that revealed exactly what George had meant by sitting down at that piano, and what Paul had understood the moment the chord reached him across that room. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001. He was 58 years old. He passed quietly, surrounded by the people closest to him, in a house in Los Angeles, filled with the kind of stillness he had always understood better than anyone. The public statement Paul McCartney released that day was brief and measured, the words of a man who had learned, across 50 years of living in public, how to grieve with a door partially closed. What happened behind that door in the weeks that followed, only the people nearest to him ever fully witnessed. But 12 months later, Paul McCartney walked onto the stage at the Royal Albert Hall. It was November 29, 2002, exactly 1 year after George died. The concert for George, a gathering of musicians who had loved him, organized by his son Donnie and the people George had kept closest across the final decade of his life. The hall held nearly 5,000 people. Every seat was filled. And when Paul McCartney appeared, the applause that rose to meet him was the kind that carries grief inside it, the kind that sounds like relief and loss, arriving at exactly the same moment. He performed several songs that evening, but it was the moment before one particular song that the people in that hall never forgot. Paul sat at the piano. He placed his hands on the keys, and before he played a single note, he paused. Just briefly, just long enough for something private to move across his face. Those seated close to the front described it the same way, independently, years apart. He looked in that moment like a man returning to a room he had left unfinished. Then he began to play, and those who had been in that London home 3 years earlier recognized the opening immediately. The same chord, the same descent, the same four notes that had stopped a room full of people mid-breath and brought Paul McCartney across the floor with his hand pressed flat against his chest. George had played it once for an audience of one. Paul played it now for everyone George had ever left behind. There is one thing about that October evening that nobody spoke about publicly for years. A woman who had been present that night, not a famous name, not someone the industry remembered, simply a person who had known both men across the long arc of their shared history, gave a brief account in a 2006 documentary that most people never saw. She was asked what she remembered most about the moment George sat down at the piano. She thought about it for a long time before answering. She said George hadn't told anyone what he was going to do. He hadn't planned a dramatic gesture, or prepared a speech, or arranged the moment for effect. He had simply looked across the room at Paul McCartney, and then he had sat down and played, as if the decision had been that quiet, as if 30 years of silence had ended not with a confrontation or a confession, but with four notes descending on a private piano on an October evening when nobody was expecting anything at all. She said something else that has stayed with everyone who ever heard it. George didn't play that song for the room, she said. He played it for Paul, because Paul was the one who needed to hear it most. And George Harrison, even at the very end, was still the one who understood that. George Harrison spent a lifetime being the Beatle the room never quite turned toward. And, in the end, the most important performance of his life required no stage, no lights, and no audience. Just one man, one piano, and 30 years of everything that had never been said, finally, quietly, set free. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, because these are the moments that remind us what music was always for.